If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Well, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world. You think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility, but I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so,
wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, was it the feeling of the...
many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people that you would have abdicated that responsibility of the people, or is that ultimately the same thing?
It.
Yeah.
Well, I do think the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. You know. And it's one of the chapters. The last chapter is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering, and it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well. And so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom and go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in, and he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he was working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you. And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series.
Mm-hmm.
You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit. And so you're a little stronger. And then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that. And then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. And so this is a good thing for people to know. If something bothers you, there's a billion things that could bother you, and not everything does. And so then you might ask, well, why does that thing bother you when some other thing that's equally bad doesn't? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is because if it bothers you, that's your problem. And you might think, I don't want to have a problem. It's like, that's because you don't know that problems and opportunities are the same thing. So if a problem's crying out for you, to you, then it could well be that your proper destiny is to address that problem, in which case it's an immense opportunity. And you saw that, exactly that. Oh, look, there's an absence in the marketplace. Well, that's a good discovery, an absence in the marketplace, especially if you're right. And so that's what you did. And then you you got a movie out of it. So that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
You know, and that's independent of its eventual success as a movie, because even if it lands at any of the levels of success it could land at, you got to make a movie. And so that's pretty good. And God only knows what you learn doing that. So there's no loss in that, right?
Yeah.
There's just gain.
There was an interesting thing that I realized during this whole thing, and it is related to what you just said. So for many years, I have told people that if you have an idea and you don't execute on it, your idea doesn't mean anything. Ideas are a dime a dozen, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And what I realized in making this movie is that I was actually wrong.
Okay.
Because if an idea, it's worthless if you don't execute it on it. I get that. But the actual idea, that if you have an idea, if you have an idea and it's good, you can't even put a price tag on that thing. And that's why when you look at Hollywood makes a bunch of what are they called? Like reruns of the same movies, right? There's a reason for that. They have all this money to throw at ideas, and they just go, well, you know what? Make the superhero movie again, make the space movie again. They just make the same movies often over and over again. And I realized that these, if you have a really good idea, you have to execute on it. You have to do something with it, because if you don't, it's like a mortal sin not to execute on a good.
Well, it's a revelation, a good idea. It's a gift. It's grace.
Where does it come from? That's why I was kind of very curious.
That's exactly right.
Because
I know the answer to that.
I look at it like, they know what molecules are in an amoeba, right?
Yeah.
We know what chemicals, and we know what's in it, but we can't make an amoeba. We can't make something alive. And just like in a movie or a book or a song, they know, you go to Nashville, they know what notes make a hit song, but they can't just produce a hit song. They can put all the chemicals in there, but they can't bring it to life. And so there is, just like there's something special about life, there's a spark that we don't understand. We can't fabricate it. We cannot fabricate that spark in life. And we can't, as far as I can tell, we can't fabricate that spark of an idea.
Okay, so there's a bunch of things that come off that. So one of the things I realized, so I've done a lot of lecturing again this year. I don't know how many different cities we went to, 60 or 70, over the last 8 months, maybe more than that, a lot. And I have a chance to develop my ideas every night. One of the things I came to understand more clearly was, this is a very cool thing, and it's relevant to what you just said, is that the spirit of your aim, you could say, answers your prayers or informs your thoughts. And it has to be that way, because thought is a navigation tool, right? You set an aim, and then your perceptions line up so you can see your way forward, but your thoughts and your emotions also aid that, because you want to get there, let's say. And then the methods by which you might advance come to mind because you've set your aim. Okay, so we can take this apart in this idea that came to you. It's like you wanted to serve your children. Okay, you wanted to serve them in a manner that was better than what was being served to them. You wanted to serve them in a manner that would help them develop in this adventurous way. So that was your goal, your aim, when you went to the library. And then what happened was there was a mismatch between what you discovered and your aim. And so now that constitutes a problem, but it also constitutes an opportunity, right? Because now you see that if your aim was correct and there's a void, well, then that's a moral problem even. Okay, so now if it's a moral problem because your aim was right and the mechanisms for that aim to be manifested aren't available, well, then that's a genuine gap and it needs to be addressed. And if you figure that out, it's your moral responsibility to do something about it, but it's also your great opportunity. Okay, so there's that. So that's what you're serving. If your aim is correct and true, and you have a revelation in relationship to that aim, and you don't act on it, you've thrown away the pathway to that aim, and you've betrayed it. That's not a good idea. But even more concretely, one of the things my wife has really learned to do in the last 2 years, she started to write and she started to speak publicly because she introduces me and talks for about 10 minutes. And she's learned during our discussions, our private discussions, let's say, if an idea emerges, she writes it down right away, no matter what we're doing, right? The idea comes, you write that thing down because it's a gift and God only knows what it's worth. You know, you could have a good idea now and then. It might be a good idea that changes your whole life. And you could have that idea and be casual enough to forget it. And that was that. And then you'd wonder why you never got anywhere. It's like, well, you had a gift and you didn't. And then there's another issue too, is the things that meet with reward grow. That's a neurological truth. That's how large language models are trained. They're trained with reinforcement. The closer they get to the target, the more weight is put on that response. So it's literally reward that trains large language models to match to target. Well, if you have a bit of a creative spark and and ideas are being revealed to you in concordance with your aim, and then you don't act on those, you punish them. You punish the source of the ideas. Just like demoralizing a kid. Like if a kid comes to you with ideas and every time they come, you say, oh, that's stupid, or what the hell do you know? Or you say, I'm going to do something about that, and then you don't. That kid will stop coming to you with ideas. Mm-hmm. And people do that to themselves all the time. Yep. And so you even have an obligation to you can watch this, you know. This is what I've been trying to teach people too, is if you want to improve your life, it's like, well, set that as an aim. I'd like things to be better. And then ask, what could I actually do that would move me somewhat in that direction? You'll get an answer. That's a good way to pray. That's a good way to pray.
And I've experienced two things here, and these are like the opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is, I think, a very positive thing for people to hear. If I was a young person, I would really like to hear this. So there are going to be times like you're talking about with your wife where all of a sudden from nowhere, or from somewhere, but somewhere that we don't know and understand, all of a sudden there's an idea there.
The source of all revelation.
It shows up.
Yeah.
It shows up. I've had that happen to me where it's like, boom, I wrote a book called Mikey and the Dragons. That came just boom. I just instantly had this idea. Boom, I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was an English major in college, and some of the old poets, they would claim that, you know, they just wrote this first, you know, the first draft, that was it. It was one draft, one shot. And there was sort of rumors about that's not really happened. They found their notes. They'd written a bunch of drafts. But sometimes it's true. Sometimes you will get that inspiration, it'll come and boom, you're done.
Yeah.
So you can sit around and wait for that. I don't recommend waiting for that, though. It may or may not come.
Yeah.
We can't control that. The other side of the spectrum, which I've also had this happen to me, and my silly term that I came up with for it is squeezing your brain. You have to like squeeze your brain and squeeze something out of it. And what I like is this idea, just to come full circle a little bit here. You know, I had this thing where I wanted to have lessons for my kids that they could read in a book.
Yeah.
And so I have that. There's my aim, what you would call an aim.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't immediately say, oh, okay, what I can have as a kid that's going through kind of kid problems and his uncle, who's a Navy SEAL, can come and stay with him for the summer and he can teach him. I didn't have that. And I definitely didn't have the nuances of like, oh, he can get bullied by this kid. And
that fills in.
Right. But I squeezed on my brain and thought, what would be a good, and then all of a sudden, boom, you just start, you find your path and the story will come or the idea will come. And
well, that's part of that disciplined striving. Like I learned when I first started writing, I forced myself to sit and write every day. Yep. And some days I was highly productive and other days I wasn't so productive. But every day, if I sat long enough, I was a little bit productive. Mm-hmm. And then I got better at being productive and much better at not delaying sitting down. That took a long time, really years to really get disciplined. I'm still learning that discipline, right? I mean,
how long do you write for at a time?
I max out about 3 hours. Okay. I find that if I write more than 3 hours continually, I get exhausted. Mm-hmm. So 3 hours is about right. And I've learned tricks like at the end of the writing session, write down what you're thinking so you can use that the next day and do it every day and so on. And I've got to the point now where I can write a newspaper article a good newspaper article pretty much in one draft, but that's taken 35 years of writing to manage that. But I learned early that if I sat long enough, I would write something that would be valuable, right? And some days it took like 45 minutes to get warmed up so that, you know, everything I wrote was just painful to produce and not of very high quality. But if you persist, the thing that persistence, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting neurologically. You know, I already said, if you punish the source within you that gives rise to ideas, it will stop producing ideas. So that's a bad idea. But it's also the case that you want to make being creative the victor over all the competing pulls and temptations. And partly what you're doing when you're disciplining yourself is that. It's like, no, I'm going to sit here, regardless of all the other things I could be doing, all the other things I could be thinking, until that part of me that's able to create wins that internal battle and prevails. And then it gets stronger and stronger over time. And that's building character. That's exactly what that is. So now you're moving towards the promised land, let's say. So that's inspiring, and that produces positive emotion, because you experience positive emotion when you see yourself moving towards a valued goal. No valued goal, no positive emotion. That's how your systems are set up psychophysiologically. On the negative front, well, maybe anger and bitterness and fear stop you. Okay, so what do you do with them? Okay, now, take good stock of your sinful nature, let's say. You know what temptations you're prone to and what knock you off the beaten track, and maybe you feel guilty about it. You know where your weaknesses are, and you probably have some idea of just what kind of hell you could inhabit if you let those weaknesses get the upper hand. So why don't you just write about that for 15 minutes? So let's say this isn't what you could have in 5 years. It's the pit you could dig for yourself if you decided to, you know, just sit there or dig. Everyone has a sense of that, you know, for some people. My temptation probably would have been alcohol. It calmed me in social situations. It made me feel a closer kinship to people, and it was a pretty good stimulant. And so it was a really good drug for me, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, too much. But I learned that I had better things to do. I wouldn't have stopped without better things to do. And that's
And what did you mean by better things to do?
Well, I was writing my book, Maps of Meaning, when I was still carousing as a graduate student. I'd started to put my life together by that point quite a bit, but I was still a party animal and very social. And but I found that I couldn't think hungover. And not only that, I couldn't handle the emotional tension of what I was dealing with intellectually. It was too, because, you know, if you're hungover, your emotions are more sensitive, especially your anxiety. And the work I was doing was way too demanding emotionally, because I was dealing with historical atrocity, and the motivations for that was just too damn dark, you know, to be dealing with hungover. Plus, once I had written a fair bit and was editing, once you've edited your work to a substantial degree, you have to use finer and finer gradations of judgment to continue to improve it. And if you're fuzzy-minded at all, if you've impaired your judgment, when you edit, you can make it worse, not better. And then I also realized that the only times I really regretted my actions was when I was drinking, because it disinhibits you, and that's fun. That can be really fun. But I'd wake up the next day and think, yeah, I was a little too provocative. I was a little too aggressive. I was a little too mean-spirited in my wit, a little too egotistical, or maybe more than little on all of those fronts. A little careless in my choice of partner, a little uncontrolled in my social behavior in places I shouldn't have been, because, you know, I was starting to, well, I was a graduate student and a teacher by that point, and I was interacting with professors, say, in a social milieu.
Grew,
yeah, well, it wasn't the time to be drunk. That just wasn't good. That worked in northern Alberta to some degree in some subcultures, but in those situations, it just made me look like a fool. Well, it made me into a fool, not just look like one. And then when you and I got married, I didn't, and we were going to have kids. I thought, well, I'm not drinking when I have kids.
Yeah, I wanted children.
Yeah, and you know, you want to grow up at that point. And besides, I was ready to dispense with all of that by then. People are often afraid of moving forward, and no wonder. But you should be way more afraid of not moving forward. And so if you get that hell behind you, it's like, well, do I want to go there? Well, I don't have the effort or the energy. I'm not even sure that it's the right thing. It's like, well, do I want to go back there? It's like, no, definitely not that. And if you don't feel that, hell, then you're not nearly as motivated as you could be. Because if you have any sense of just exactly how bloody dismal and dark things could get, then, and that's right there for you. And that was one thing that...
I thought it was helpful. I thought it was helpful when I did the future authoring to think about where I would go if I went to the wrong place.
Why?
Well, it's just good to know how you will fall apart.
Yeah, well,
that
and then
it's
you
possible?
can. Well, and you can also ask yourself, and studying historical atrocity also helped me with that. It's like, well, do you want to be a what would you call a sadist? You're bitter and resentful. You want to hurt other people? Is that where you want to end up? You want to lie and deceive? Because that's where you end up if you lie and deceive. You want to be resentful and bitter? Because that's where you end up if you're resentful and bitter.
Yeah, but sometimes, you know, people, they just don't know what to do about it. So your program helps them to make a plan.
Yeah, well, and the plan is really, look, we're visionaries, man. Human beings are visionaries. Really.
Well, I found when I did the self-authoring, the 15 minutes of writing that I did, the dreaming I did,
Yeah.
when I wrote about my future and just dreamed of what it could be like if it was just what I wanted.
Yeah.
And then outlined the goals, because you outline goals after that in the future authoring. Those things that I had identified appeared in my life. Those.
Yeah, well.
And that was quite shocking to me.
Well, the thing is, you look at the world through a goal-directed framework. And so when you switch your goals, what appears to you in the world switches. It's mystical in a sense, but in another sense, it's just understandable. It's like, well, if I look that way, I see the TV and the couch, and if I look this way, I see you in the chair. Well, that's not that mysterious, but what I've done is I've changed the reality that manifests itself to me just by changing the direction of my orientation. Well, we do that metaphysically as well. And so, for example, if you decide that you're going to be courageously trusting towards people when they offer you an opportunity, even though you're skeptical and timid, but you decide, no, I'm going to have some faith in people, so I'm going to be courageous and trusting, then when they open a door to you that's an opportunity, you'll think, oh, that's a door I could walk through, instead of thinking I'm moving into a trap. And it's the same reality in some sense, but the way that you're interacting with it changes. Well, it can change. It can invert. It can change so radically that it barely looks like you're living in the same world. There are a lot of potential interpretations that you can validly lay on the world, and some of them are extremely positive, and they still work. And wouldn't that be lovely if you could lay an incredibly positive vision on the world in a calculating and strategic manner, not an instrumental manner, right? Because you're aiming at something genuinely good, and that would work. And that is how the world works. One of the things I loved, maybe we can end with this too, one of the things I loved about my clinical practice, I loved this. It was so good, and I miss it. We were always working, the best parts of me and my client were working together to make everything about their lives better. And it worked. You know, like I had lots of female clients who tripled their income in 4 years. They didn't even think that was possible. It's like, well, I don't make enough money. I'm barely making ends meet, single mothers. I have no idea what to do. I don't like my job. It's like, well, let's make a plan here. You know, what do you want? Well, I'd like to make this much money. Why don't we double that? And just, because you're going to aim at something. Some people do make more money than that, so maybe it could be you. Well, is that even possible? It's not even possible. It's like, well, let's just assume that maybe it's possible and see what you'd have to do. Well, you got to get your CV together. Well, it's full of holes. Okay, well, let's fix the holes. Okay, now you got to get a plan. Well, I'm not very good at interviews. Okay, let's practice interviewing till you're not just good at it, you're looking forward to it.
But you know, I had this crazy professor that I met at the University of Alberta when I was about 18, and he was quite the bizarre person. He vanished one day about 20 years later. He got on a bus in Winnipeg and to go visit his family and never showed up, and they never found a trace of him. Anyways, at the University of Alberta, he worked as the psychologist at the maximum security prison that was located nearby, and he took me out there a couple of times, and so that was quite the hair-raising experience. And I met some pretty serious psychopaths in the Edmonton maximum security prison. And he was a funny guy. This Thauberger was his name. He used to give us multiple choice tests. He did a course on creativity, and now and then he'd throw in a multiple choice test question, and all 4 answers would be the same, which I thought was, guess that was creative, and it was certainly funny, I thought. And you know, some of the students really hated him, but I thought he was great. He was really cool. And what did he say about suicide? You can always do it tomorrow. Yeah, well, you know, that's pretty good. It's pretty good. That's a pretty good piece of advice. It's like, you know, you don't get to do it twice if you're successful. So is it not possible just to wait? You know, can you just wait? And that's pretty generic advice, but it's definitely worth thinking about, you know, because it's final act. Then I would say too, let people around you know. You don't want to keep that a secret. And if you don't have anyone to tell, really it's time to go to the hospital and tell someone. And you tell, when you go to the hospital, you say, I'm suicidal. And I have a plan, and here's my plan. And that's, by the way, how you assess someone for suicidality, you know. Because depressed people, lots of people get depressed, will have suicidal thoughts, and they're far from rare. And so then you might ask yourself, well, how do you know when someone's suicidal? And they're suicidal when they say to you, you say, well, do you ever think self-destructive thoughts? And they say, you know, yeah, you know, in my father's house, there's a basement and there's a pistol down there, and it's in the top right-hand corner of the bureau, and I know the bullets for that gun are in the bottom left-hand drawer, and you know, I've taken that gun out of that drawer and I've toyed with it, and I thought, you know, my parents are leaving next week for a weekend, and they won't be back, and I could go into the bathroom and put the barrel in my mouth and end it. It's like, that's a suicidal person. And you know that because they're not just being plagued by vague thoughts. They have a fully detailed, implementable vision of their death. And that's not good. And so if there's anybody in the audience who has that sort of fully fleshed out fantasy, I would say, tell someone, you know, tell someone, or more than one person. Tell the closest person you have to someone who cares, you know. And if you don't have anybody to tell, then go to the hospital and tell them, because the probability is pretty high if you're suicidal that there's actually something wrong with you, that you're ill in some manner, you know. And maybe you're depressed, but there's a lot of reasons to be depressed. Sometimes you might be depressed because you just have a terrible life, and that's very complicated. But sometimes you're depressed because you have an immunological condition, or an inflammatory condition, or you know, you're ill in some way that hasn't been diagnosed, or you have seasonal affective disorder and your circadian rhythms are off. Like, there's a lot of reasons that you can get desperate enough to be suicidally depressed, and there's always the possibility that that can be fixed. And so, and it's tricky, because when you're depressed, you definitely think that the future is dismal, and you know, the past is dismal and the present is unbearable and the future is definitely worse, and it's all your fault besides. And that's basically the depressive cloud. It affects everything. It's very low level, profound, deep brain and psychic state. But it's generally rectifiable. And, you know, since you can always do it tomorrow, you might as well run the whole gamut of treatments before you make the final decision. So that's what I would tell people who are Oh, and the other thing too, you got to understand too about suicide is that if there are people around you that love you, it's pretty likely that they'll never really recover. And so, you know, you might be thinking that if you took yourself out, you'd be doing the people around you a favor, and often people who are depressed, they really believe that. But, you know, I've had lots of clients who were pretty damn traumatized by a familial suicide, and they just torture themselves for the rest of their life thinking, you know, what if, well, I had one client, for example, her relative committed suicide an hour after she missed a phone call from him. It's like, how the hell do you recover from that, you know? Because you just think, well, you know, if I would have just been there, and then you can't talk to the person about it. There's no real way of rectifying that. You just live with that guilt, and it's a pretty damn awful thing. That's why most societies regard suicide as a crime, you know, because you leave an aftermath of catastrophic destruction in your wake, and that's also not a good thing. So, you know, if you're depressed, you're going to think it's going to be better for everyone else if you're just gone, but generally that's far from the truth. Almost inevitably, it's far from the truth. So those are some things you need to know on the suicide analysis and prevention front. There are people who are neurologically damaged, who have physiological reasons for difficulty in maintaining optimized attentional focus. You see that in people, for example, who have fetal alcohol syndrome. Most of the time, as far as I'm concerned, it's a rubbish diagnosis. Panksepp, the same neuroscientist that I talked to you about, who investigated play behavior in rats, also noted, this is quite fun, that if you deprive juvenile male rats of the opportunity to play boisterously, they become hyperactive. And also, if you deprive them of the opportunity to play optimally, their prefrontal cortices do not mature well. And the prefrontal cortex matures late, and it constitutes, in some sense, the pinnacle of neurological development, and it needs to develop in the course of intense play. And then he noticed that if you administered hyperactive play-deprived rats amphetamine, Ritalin, that it would inhibit their frenetic playing. And that's pretty much what's happening in schools. So the schools are not well adapted to boys. I don't think they're particularly well adapted to girls either, by the way, but they're particularly not well adapted to boys. Boys aren't designed to sit still and be bored out of their skulls for 7 hours a day. And there are boys with particular temperaments who are even less inclined to be able to do that. So, for example, if you're extroverted, highly social, possessed by a fair bit of enthusiasm and positive emotion, then you're going to appear more hyperactive. If you're creative, then your attention is going to be fragmented in some sense by the multiplicity of your interests. So if you're creative and extroverted, then you have both of those working against you in terms of your quiescent adaptation to the school environment. If you're disagreeable, which is also more likely if you're male, then you're quite likely to push back against what you see as stupid, arbitrary rules. And so we know perfectly well, for example, that attention deficit disorder overlaps with childhood conduct disorder and antisocial behavior. And I'm not saying that all children diagnosed with hyperactivity are conduct disordered. I'm saying that more aggressive boys tend to manifest symptoms that sometimes tilt them towards juvenile criminality and sometimes tilt them towards attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. But it's partly their somewhat rebellious temperament. And so if you're disagreeable and extroverted and creative, then well, then why wouldn't you be hyperactive? When amphetamines were first used to treat hyperactivity, the hypothesis was the following. Kids who are hyperactive or attention deficit disordered are of a different neurological type. Now, as I said, in rare circumstances, that's true. But absent evidence for neurological dysfunction, I would hesitate to make that presumption. The run-of-the-mill hyperactive boy, if you put him on amphetamines, Ritalin, his attentional focus improves. Now, the original hypothesis was that's because these abnormally neurologically structured hyperactive boys have a paradoxical reaction to amphetamine administration. It calms them down, whereas with normal people, they become more stimulated, okay? There's a word for that theory, and the word is wrong. Okay, so more intelligent and differentiated analysis has indicated that if you give any child amphetamines, the grip of what they're attending to is stronger. So all children are calmed down by stimulants perversely, because the psychomotor stimulant, which is a dopamine agonist, which activates the focal exploratory system, does increase the capacity for focal attention. But it does that with all children. And so a positive reaction to amphetamine in relationship to attentional focus is no indication whatsoever, even in the most minute manner, that the diagnosis was correct. And so I don't buy it, except in these rare cases, is that we use amphetamines to conveniently modify the behavior of bored boys, because we're too stupid to construct our education systems in a manner that doesn't drive them mad. Look, you know, normal university students take Ritalin like mad in university because they learn that they can sustain attention, whether that's productive or not in the long run is a whole different issue, but they can sustain attention with less effort if they use amphetamines. Now, that's a degenerating game, fundamentally, like most drug use. And I suppose if it's very carefully regulated and the doses are low, then the negative consequences are less dramatic. But I think the whole thing's just, it's a psychosocial fraud. It's a, what do they call that? When a system produces there's a name for a disease that's created by doctors. I can't remember it. What's the word? Iatrogenic? Iatrogenic? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, hyperactivity is an iatrogenic disease created by schools. Yeah, that's the case. So boys should play more, way more than they do, way more. They should play to the point of exhaustion in some sense every day. Really, really. They'll quit when they've had enough. And you might think, well, you never get messages from God. It's like, yeah, actually you do. It's your conscience. And that pesky little thing doesn't exactly do what you want it to do. It tends to upbraid you on a fairly regular basis and remind you of your various idiocies and inadequacies. And you might think that that's you speaking, but then you might ask, well, why does it tell you things you don't want to hear then? And why can't you control it? And those are both extraordinarily good objections. And the what would you call it? The equation of conscience with the God within, let's say, isn't something I've just invented either. There's a very pronounced and profound thread of Catholic thinking in particular that identifies the conscience with the voice of God within. And it's an idea that emerges in the Old Testament with the prophet Moses. And who's the prophet. He appears with Christ when he's transfigured on the mount. It's Moses and Elijah, who is the first person to posit that God is not in nature, but is the still small voice within, right? So that's what comes to Jonah. And it says, just what the conscience always says, that you have to go do something you'd rather not do. You have to admit something you don't want to do. You have to undertake some remedial action that you don't want to undertake. You have to atone for your bloody sins, and sometimes for the sins of other people. And so the voice comes to Jonah and says, you know, there's a city some distance from you, Nineveh, and it's full of your enemies. And so the people of Nineveh are the historical enemies of the Israelites at that time. But despite the fact that it's a city of your enemies, I want you to go there, because I'm not very happy with the Ninevites. They've wandered off the pathway, and I'm feeling like giving them a good smiting, and if they don't straighten up, there won't be any of them left. And I'm sort of, deliberating about whether or not my choice in that regard is acceptable, and I thought I might send you there just to see if they'll straighten out. And Jonah thinks, yeah, I don't think so, buddy. First of all, I just soon see them go to hell in a handbasket, because they're my enemies and they're the habitual enemies of the Israelite people, so why would I give a damn if they live or die? And since they're my enemies, it might be better if they burn in hell for all I'm concerned, so no, I don't think I'm going to go there. And there's 150,000 of them and one of me, and I'm their enemy, and so why? This sounds like a very bad strategy as far as I'm concerned. So Jonah does what people always do, and he thinks, I think I'll just hightail it in the other direction, which is exactly what you do when you're called upon to say something that you bloody well know you should say, and you don't. And furthermore, you also think in your pride and foolishness that you can get away with it, and you can't, because you never get away with anything. So, and if you think you do, that's that same voice of pride telling you that you are capable of bending or twisting the fabric of reality itself without it snapping back and taking you out. And that is not a wise thing to think. Anyways, Jonah hightails it in the other direction. He takes a boat and he's off to parts unknown. There's no damn way he's going to Nineveh. And so what happens? Well, Jonah is called upon to speak, and he doesn't. And so his life starts to destabilize, as yours will if you're called upon to speak and you hold your tongue. And so the waves rise and the wind blows, and the ship that's Jonah's on, which is the ark or the ship of state, you can think about it either way, is now in danger. And that's exactly what happens to the ship of state when the people who are on board it refuse to say what they have to say and run away instead. And so the waves rise and the wind blows and the ship is in danger, and the sailors, a rather superstitious lot, think, there's probably someone on this boat who isn't quite right with God. And that's a pretty good thing to think, actually, when your shopkeepers are starting to lock up your ice cream because the thieves come in the night to steal it, which seems to be is what's happening in New York right now, and you think that the waves are starting to rise and the wind is starting to blow, and maybe that's because people aren't saying what they have to say. And so Jonah is asked by the sailors, is everything okay with the God you worship in you? And Jonah, who's still a relatively honest man, says, well, no, as a matter of fact, I had a direct commandment from Yahweh. And they say, well, who's this Yahweh? And he says, well, he's the creator of the entire universe, which makes him first and foremost among the gods. And the sailors are pretty short-circuited about this, because they're worshiping these low-level gods who are maybe in charge of like the local tavern or something, and now they've come up with Yahweh, and he's like king of the universe, and now you have Jonah who defied a direct commandment, and they think, well, that doesn't seem like a very good idea if you actually believe in this guy. And nonetheless, the sailors are even pretty good guys, and they try to make for port so they don't have to throw poor Jonah overboard, but it's God they're dealing with, creator of the universe, so the waves just get bigger, and that's just not so good. And finally they think, all right, throw him overboard. And so he's overboard. And so what's the moral of the story there? It's like, keep your mouth closed when you have something to say, and let the cat take your tongue when it asks to, and you'll end up drowning in the briny deep. And you think, well, that's pretty harsh. It's like, no, that's nothing. I mean it. That's nothing. If you think
that danger of death is the worst thing that can happen to you if you walk off the straight and narrow path. You know nothing about life. There are things that are far worse than death. And if you have even the least bit of familiarity with the catastrophic history of the 20th century and all the brutality that went along with all the silence and lies, you'd know perfectly well that death is one of the things you have to fear the least. And so what happens to Jonah? He's drowning away. That's pretty miserable, but that's nothing. The beast comes up from hell itself, right? And takes him in its mouth and pulls him down to the depths. And you might say, well, what are the depths? What's this whale? It's the jaws of hell. Well, and how do you know that? Well, he's there for 3 days. It's the same 3 days that Christ spends harrowing hell. It says in the story of Jonah that it's a beast from hell. That's a hint. The parallels are there as well as the direct representations, and it's part of the standard mythological landscape. And what it means is that, look, if you fail to say what you have to say when it's your turn to talk, it isn't just your life that you're putting in danger. It's the entire bloody social contract. So what did Solzhenitsyn note in the Gulag Archipelago, which was perhaps the greatest study of totalitarian atrocity and the psychological reasons, practical reasons as well for the existence of that atrocity? Solzhenitsyn's conclusion was, a totalitarian state isn't a dictator oppressing the freedom-loving masses. That's a fool's vision of the world. It's the universal grip of the lie on every soul, every single one. Not a single man in a totalitarian state is willing to stand up and say what he knows to be true. And that's the totalitarian state. So what happens if you don't say what you have to say? Well, then you go to hell and you take everyone you love with you. And that's what happens. And then I'll close with this. And that's not like some story. It is some story. But it's also what actually happens, as bluntly as it can be stated. And so that's another reason why it doesn't take courage to say what you have to say when you're called upon to speak. It takes wisdom, and that's not the same thing. Okay, and I'll close with this. Here's something to think about as well. I've been writing about the story of Abraham. Abraham's an interesting story. So it opens up with a guy who's already in paradise. At least he's in the socialist utopia paradise. And I mean that. In that he has everything he needs given to him. So his state has fulfilled for him the Marxist dictum of each according to his need. Abraham has rich parents. He has everything he needs in his tent. He can lay there and let half-naked slave girls wave palm fronds over him, eat peeled grapes. And he does that till he's like 75. And no wonder. Anyways, a voice comes to him and says, okay, buddy, up and at him. It's time to get away from your tent and get away from your mom and get away from your dad and get away from your family and your tribe and to go out in the world and have an adventure. And so Abraham listens. Oddly enough, he listens, and he goes out on his adventure, and it's one bloody cataclysmic catastrophe after another. It's starvation and tyranny and the conspiracy of the Egyptian aristocracy to steal his beautiful wife, and war and death and the necessary calling for the sacrifice of his son. It's just a cataclysm. And through all that, God promises him that if he maintains his faith, he'll be the father of nations. And what does that mean? It means if you have the adventure of your life, then everything that could possibly be granted to you will be granted to you. And then you might ask, well, how do you have the adventure of your life? And the answer is, you tell the truth. You exercise your right and responsibility to free speech. You tell the truth. And then you might say, well, why is that an adventure? Well, first I could say, try it. But I could say, let's explain it. Why is it an adventure? And also, why is it your adventure? Well, if you're lying, whatever happens to you, that's not your adventure. If you're lying and something happens to you, that's the adventure of the spirit of the lie. The lie that you think you told, but that actually possesses you. And the adventure of the spirit of the lie is hell. And so that's not a good idea. So it's not you that has that adventure, because if it was you, that would be you speaking. And if it was you speaking, that would be your truth. That would be the truth. That would be your adventure. And then you might say, well, if it's my truth, it's me, but why is that an adventure? And I can tell you why that is. Imagine that you're having a conversation with someone and you've already decided what you want the outcome of the conversation to be. You want something from that person. You want them to sleep with you. You want them to give you money. You want them to admire you. You want them to think you're beautiful. You have some instrumental goal in mind, and maybe it's even a somewhat noble goal, but it's instrumental. You craft your words so that you manipulate the situation, so that you obtain from the person you're communicating with, the crowd you're communicating with, what it is that you want. And maybe you get it. And then maybe you say, well, what's wrong with that? And what's wrong with that is like, well, what the hell do you know? Really, I'm dead serious. Have you never got something that you were aiming at that was the wrong thing to get? That happens to you all the time. I mean, sometimes you fail too, and that's obviously not pleasant, but the worst kind of failure is to get exactly what you're aiming for and find out that the lies you had to tell to get it turned out to deliver to you something that not only had no value, but that was actually contrary to your best interests. And then you might say, well, how could you possibly exist in the world otherwise? Because you have to have a plan, you have to be aiming at something, you have to be wanting something to even communicate. And I could say, well, actually, that's not true. You can replace that instrumental longing with faith. And here's the basis of faith, a form of faith. The basis of the highest form of faith is the decision to accept the proposition that whatever happens if you live in truth is by definition the best thing that can possibly happen, despite your inability as a consequence of your limitations to have the wisdom to see that. And it's a statement of faith, because there's no way of demonstrating the validity of that proposition before enacting the hypothesis. You have to commit to it. Well, let's make it practical. I manipulate you and I get what I want, but then I find out I didn't want what I wanted, and so instead I don't manipulate you. Instead, what I do every time I speak, is I make things as clear to myself and everyone else as I possibly can. Right? And let the devil take the consequences. And so what's the consequence of that? You have no idea what's going to happen next. Right? You throw caution to the wind. You have no idea. You think, well, I better not say that because this might happen. It's like you just have to let that go. It's like, no, this is the thing to say now. And whatever happens, bring it on. Well, that's an adventure. Right, that's an adventure. And if you do it enough, then you have the adventure of your life. And then, if you have the adventure of your life, it's so bloody interesting and so engaging and so exciting that it justifies the misery of your existence. So I know that. And that's why I say what I have to say. And that's why I said what I had to say tonight. And so Thank you very much.
12 rules you have. Your rule number 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders straight. Number 2 is treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. 3 is befriend people who want the best for you. 4 is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not the useless person you are today. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Set your house in order before you criticize the world. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Tell the truth or at least don't lie. That's number 8. Assume the person you're listening to knows something you don't. Be precise in your speech. Do not bother children while they're skateboarding. And then last but not least, pet a cat when you encounter one in the street. I heard somewhere you said it was 40 rules and you narrowed it down to 12.
It was originally 42, and I'm working on another set of 12.
So what was the cutoff? Like, what was number 13 that missed out? Was it like a battle for number? I'm curious to know what number 13 was for you.
Well, I tried to pick a set that would make a coherent narrative, and so it wasn't like the rules differed in quality particularly. I think they were all worth writing about. But when you write a book, you want it to have a certain internal consistency, and so I went for that. A couple of the rules that didn't make it were be careful who you share good news with. That's a good one, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and that's one way that you can identify those people who are truly on your side.
Wow.
That's
powerful.
There was a corollary to that, which was be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You know, you want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, you know, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. That's what I'm writing about now. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful because, well, beauty calls people to their higher being, I would say, and to make friends with beauty is to introduce yourself very carefully to one of the mysteries of life that make it worth living. And so those are a few of the rules that didn't make the original cut, but that I'm still working on and still thinking about.
I'm definitely looking forward to reading the next book that you come out with. Those were very interesting rules. Appreciate you for sharing it with us. Thank you for sharing it with us. So you know, there's this saying that says, tough times produce strong men produce good times produce weak men produce tough times.
Yes.
If that's the truth, which phase are we in today?
Well, if you think about it historically, you have to say that we're in good times. I mean, that doesn't mean everything about the current times are good, and of course life is always tenuous and difficult, but it's 1919. If you go back 100 years ago, imagine what the last 5 years would have been like, right? The entire world was encapsulated in a terrible war. The trench warfare was absolutely brutal, and that was a 5-year period, and then that was followed by the Spanish influenza, which killed 120 million people. And, you know, so I'd rather be here now than there then by a substantial margin. And I think life is never easy, even under relatively positive conditions. But I would say that it's very difficult to make the case that we're not in good times. And I especially think that's true if you look at the world globally. The American working class, and maybe the Western working class in general, paid a very large price for enriching the rest of the world. You know, I mean, China's come up in a miraculous way in the last 40 years. South Korea, India, well, the entire, in all of Southeast Asia, and increasingly Africa too, because the fastest growing economies in the world are now in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's produced a tremendous competition for working class people in the West. But speaking on a global level, there's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then, you know, maybe things can continue to improve. The rate of absolute poverty in the world has fell by 50% between the year 2000 and the year 2012. You know, that's the fastest rate of economic improvement in the history of the world, and there's plenty of reason to be optimistic if you're inclined in that direction. I would say it's best to marry that with a healthy dose of attentive caution, because, well, as I said, things can go badly wrong. But I can't think of a time in the past that I would trade for now, despite all the problems that are also part and parcel of being alive now.
So do you think these good times will produce weak men, or you don't buy that? You think in any times we're going to have weak, strong people being produced?
Well, I think there is a certain danger in luxury. You know, we don't know how necessary a certain degree of privation is to motivation. You know, the typical first generation immigrant story is someone arrives with nothing and is motivated fully to do whatever is necessary to make either themselves or their children a success. And that does seem to decline. That motivation does seem to decline somewhat over the following generations. So, for example, Asian immigrants, their children outperform American children in school by a substantial margin, but that disappears by about 3 generations, that advantage.
Wow, that disappears in 3 generations.
Yeah. As the Asian immigrants become more Americanized, their proclivity to excel academically.
You guys understand that concept? Powerful. So I come first generation, I'm more disciplined. My kid becomes less disciplined. My grandkids become less disciplined, and the one prior to that, you know, past that also gets less disciplined.
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, and you probably face this to some degree because, you know, you have a lot of resources at your command. It's very difficult to provide your children with optimal privation in order to make them stand on their own 2 feet, you know, and you don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum. Well, it's a real conundrum as you become successful, because you're in a situation where if your children ask you for something, there's no formal reason for you to say no, you know, because you can provide whatever is being requested. But by doing that, you steal from them the opportunity to generate that for themselves. And that's, I suppose, one of the dangers of, well, it's one of the dangers of prosperity. What that does to people over the long run, I don't think we understand well yet, because most people haven't been prosperous for very long, right? There's been plenty of privation to go around, and of course there still is in many, many parts of the world, including in the United States and in the West.
Do you think we're getting softer and more sensitive? Do you think in general, especially America, because America's been successful now for quite some time, we're constantly growing. Do you think we are becoming softer and more sensitive?
Well, I think there's a push in that direction. There certainly seems to be a technical push in that direction in the universities.
Why?
Well, it's complicated, you know. Generally when I try to assess something like that, there's a rule if you're a social scientist, and the first rule is, in some sense, to look at context before you look at personality. And I think there's been a lot of really radical changes in our society in the last 50 years, and we don't understand their consequences. The most radical change is probably the birth control pill, because it's provided women with voluntary control over the reproductive function. And that's equivalent to a major biological mutation, right? Its consequence is virtually incomprehensible. I mean, partly one of the consequences is you know, where reliable birth control is provided to women, first of all, they immediately become educated. Second, their economies tend to grow. And third, the birth rate falls below replacement. And then all three of those factors are monumental, you know, so perhaps especially the third, the falling of the birth rate below replacement, which is the case in virtually every country in the Western world except the United States. Softness. Well, look, like, we don't know exactly what the optimal conditions are under which you toughen up, let's say. Most children now have older parents, right? Because people aren't having children until they're in their 30s. And there's a big difference between having a parent who's in his or her 30s and having a parent who's in his or her 20s.
Yep.
The 20-year-olds are still kind of like kids, and they're going to be more usefully neglectful, I would say. Well, look, one of the things we used to do with my daughter when she was very little was, you know, she was about a year and a half, is we'd have her in a room alone, and she would usually complain about that for a few minutes, and then she'd find a way to amuse herself. You know, she liked to take books out of shelves and put them back in, and like if you let her get through that initial bit of misery, then she would learn how to regulate herself, and she got very good at that. And so that's a good example of minor privation having a positive influence. But you know, children used to have multiple siblings, and siblings toughen you up because there's tremendous competition in families among siblings, and they had younger parents who had fewer resources. And you know, now parents are older, first of all, and second, they're more resource rich, and so they're more likely to schedule their children to death in some sense to provide them with all the opportunities that they feel would be useful, and that's understandable. And plus, because they have fewer children, each child is in some sense more precious. You know, not like if you have 10 children, you don't love all of them, but you know, there's 10 of them. There's only so much excess attention that can go around, and they do a lot of socializing each other rather than being socialized by parents. But if you only have one child, you know, you're going to devote all your resources to providing them with absolutely everything you can provide them with, and one of the dangers of that is that you'll overprotect them and you'll provide them with too much. And we don't understand those dynamics, right? We don't understand how much you should stay hands off your kids and let them go out there and make their own mistakes and find their own way. And that's tricky, and we're ignorant about it. And so I think one of the consequences of that is that we do have a reasonable percentage of young people, maybe young adolescents, the kind that you hear about at university, who have been overprotected and overscheduled and under-challenged in some sense. We extend that overprotection far longer than is helpful. You know, it's hard though, because as I said, when you have resources, you can use them to make your children's lives, let's say, easier. But the question is, like, do you really want to make the life of someone you love easier? And that's an incredibly difficult question.
And it's tough because how do you know, the whole thing is when your kids' friends go and say, hey, I heard your mommy and daddy are rich. Why isn't your mom buying you this car? Why isn't your dad buying you this car? But was your underlying message you encouraging us? Because there's a lot of Latinos in the room here. Were you trying to encourage us to go out there and have 10 babies? Is that what you're trying to say? That kind of, you're talking, they will make 10 babies in a heartbeat if you say that. These are professionals that making babies here.
Well, my wife and I had 2 kids, and we didn't start late compared to most of the people we knew. I think our first child was born when my wife was 29. We certainly felt that we would have had more children if we would have started earlier. There's no doubt that, and this is a very important thing to know, there's not that many things in your life that are of central importance. There's half a dozen, I would say. There's your friends, there's your family, your intimate partner. By family, I mean your siblings and your parents, but then there's your children, there's your career, there's your educational trajectory, there's how you take care of yourself and protect yourself from temptation, and what sort of useful things you do in the time that you're not working. But children are a third of life, something like that, maybe more. And so I would certainly recommend that you don't miss it. It's complicated because, of course, now in most situations both parents have to work, and but it's always been complicated to raise children. They're a long-term investment, but yeah, right, which is hard. That's why it's hard to even pay childcare workers, right? Because the payoff for having a child doesn't occur until 2 decades later, or sometimes 4 decades later. But it's not something you want to miss, that's for sure, because it's well, that's life, It's part of the human condition, and little children pay you back immensely if you have a good relationship with them, if you're on their side and encourage them, because they're an unconditional source of joy and love.
Powerful.
The other thing I noticed that you should all know is that as you get older, your family, the family you've produced, becomes more and more important. So we teach young women in particular that the fundamental goal of their life is going to be their career. And, first of all, most people don't have careers, they have jobs. And those are very different things. But you're not a very happy camper, so to speak, if you're 45 and you have no one. And it doesn't go upwards after that. So don't miss it.
So, Jordan, follow up to that. I got a question for you. Very good point. Follow up to that with you is, we're going to have President Bush here speaking in the next 2 days. I don't know when he's speaking in the next 2 days, but he's speaking. I can't say because Secret Service told me I can't give the specific time. Everyone's trying to figure it out. I almost gave you the time. Some of you guys were waiting for that. But, why is it that so many powerful political families send their kids off to boarding school? And I don't know, as a clinical psychologist, how much research or how much of that have you looked at with the link to boarding school teaches independence, toughens them up a little bit, the whole opportunity to have your kids have a little bit more challenging times for them to go through? What are your thoughts on boarding school?
Well, I don't think that there's any evidence that, there's not a lot of evidence that school quality per se is a determining factor in the outcome of educational processes. That actually seems to be a situation. I mean, there are exceptions, and I'm certainly not trying to say that every school is equal, but a tremendous amount of what determines whether or not a child is successful at school is their intelligence. I mean, you people all went to high school, to junior high school. I mean, you know that in a group of 30 kids, there's some kids that are so bright that they figure everything out in the first 15 seconds, and there are other kids who just can't get it no matter how hard they try. And that's one of the really catastrophic and built-in inequalities in the world, generally in boarding schools, because wealth and intelligence tend to be correlated, which is also something you'd expect, right? You'd expect more intelligent people to be able to make more money, or you'd certainly at least expect less intelligent people to be able to make less money. The schools generally produce good outcomes, but it's not obvious that it's because of the schools. And this is true at higher levels of education too, to a degree that people don't really realize. So for example, at a university like Harvard, any of the Ivy Leagues, it's very, very difficult to get in, right? So there's far more applicants than there are positions, and they use the SAT as one of the entry criteria. So you have to have a very high SAT score, and then generally you have to be good at least one or two other things to be considered. And a very large percentage, for example, of Harvard undergraduates, and there's only about 4,000 of them, so it's a rather small school, were valedictorians of their class. And they have very high SAT scores, and the SAT is a proxy for IQ. The people who administer the SAT don't like to admit that, but there's absolutely no doubt that it's the case, because any set of questions that assess general knowledge and problem-solving ability you can derive an IQ score from. And so part of the advantage of hiring an Ivy League graduate isn't the fact that they went to a high-quality school, it's the fact that it was impossible to get in. And so the screening has been done for the employer by the admissions process at the school. And the same thing is true of business schools, and the people who run business schools know that, is that the primary value that they offer, and again, this is not the case with every business school, is the fact that if you hire an MBA from their program, and it's a very selective program, then you have a very high probability of hiring someone who's intrinsically intelligent and conscientious. And that's a great predictor. Those are great predictors of long-term success. So, and what would you expect in a society that's essentially meritocratic? It's pretty straightforward to think this through. Not only should people who are faster and smarter be more productive, especially if they're hardworking, but that's really what you'd want, isn't it? I mean, how the hell do you want to set up your society? You want to set up your society so that incompetent people who do nothing succeed? That first of all, that can't happen. So, you know, and I should say that I'm very aware of the unfairness of a meritocratic society, of its intrinsic unfairness. So let me give you an example. I had someone write me the other day. He had listened to some of my lectures on IQ, and he sent me his IQ scores. And he was in the 5th percentile, which basically meant that 95% of the people around him were faster cognitively than he was. And, you know, the letter it wasn't very grammatically correct, and it wasn't very well written, although it was very sad. And he said that he had a very difficult time finding a job and keeping one, that he was constantly frustrated and unnerved. And that's a terrible thing, you know, because it's not as if it's his fault. A lot of what constitutes your innate cognitive ability, or your cognitive ability, is something that's really granted to you by fortune and fate. And I mean, you can make someone stupider, but it's very difficult to make someone smarter, although hard work definitely is a plus. People stack up at the bottom, and it's not easy to figure out how to deal with that, but because you need the people who are leading the cognitive revolutions to develop entrepreneurial enterprises and to run things properly and to invent the new things that we all use, and hopefully to raise the living standards of society in general.
So do you think, you said it's easier to make people stupider. That's what you said. It's easier to make people stupider.
Oh, definitely. Well, you can do that by depriving them of nutrition when they're children. I mean, one of the things we know, and this is from Bjorn Lomborg's work, which I would really recommend. Lomborg has put together a team of economists to rank order problems in the world by return on investment in solving them. So you imagine, maybe there's 100 problems that beset the world, from starvation to lack of water, to lack of sanitary facilities, to lack of education, to tyrannical governance, to, well, you can continue the list in your own imagination. What Lomborg did was consult very high-level economists who he put in teams to find out where you get the biggest return for your foreign policy dollar over a reasonable stretch of time, and it's clearly the case that if you invest in early childhood nutrition, that pays off at about 250 to 1. And so one of the ways that you can impair children's intelligence permanently is by ensuring that they don't have enough to eat when they're very young. And that's actually something that can be addressed very inexpensively, and it's to everyone's benefit. So that's one way you can make people. Oh yes.
So let me ask you this: do you think media makes us smarter or stupider?
I think it makes some people smarter and some people stupider. I mean, well, look at television. See, you got to kind of fragment. You got to kind of fragment the people that you're talking about into different groups. It's like asking whether daycare is good for kids or not, and the answer is, if the daycare is better than your family, then daycare is good for you. And and I actually mean that technically, because the studies of early childhood daycare indicate that for some kids it's perfectly fine, and for other kids it's not. It's good if your kid is extroverted and ready to play with other children and so forth. There's a lot of individual differences that have to be taken into account. So media in general, look, imagine that you're a little kid and your parents are neglectful and you're in your crib most of the time, but the television is on. Well, that's a hell of a lot better than just being in your crib. And so it is pretty clear too, over the last century, on average, IQ levels have gone up by quite a substantial amount. And the reason for that seems to be that the very low end has been pushed up. And some of that's going to be a consequence of increased nutrition, and some of it's going to be a consequence of the fact that television is a lot better than nothing, like infinitely better. Now, whether television is better for you than a diet of high quality literature, that's a whole different question. Whether it's better for you than playing properly with your peers, engaging in pretend play and all the other things that you have to do to establish yourself as a competent child, that's also another question. But generally speaking, I would say that the dispersion of the media technology we have has made us far more intelligent. And the other thing that's worth thinking about too is that computers also make us more intelligent, I would say, not because of the content, but because of the technology. You got to be pretty damn organized and sharp to keep your phone and your computer working. These are high maintenance gadgets, and it actually annoys the hell out of me because, I was sort of old enough so that computers came along. A lot of people my age aren't very good at using computers, and people who are older are even worse. I made a decision when the computers started to become omnipresent, and so that would have been about 1993, that I was going to spend a year, and that was the first year that I was teaching in Boston, pretty much doing nothing but figuring out how Intel 486s worked. And it meant there was a lot of other things that I had to put on hold, but I did become a competent computer user, and I'm pretty fast. But my son, it's just annoying as hell to watch him on the computer and on the phone, and my graduate students as well, because they're so much faster than me that it's not even funny, and I'm not really accustomed to being slower than someone else in the room. And so You know, it's you know, the other thing you see too is that, I mean, certainly I would say if my son and my daughter are both competent technology users, my son in particular, although my daughter has her shining spots too, especially for use of social media. But you know, if I had children now, the one thing I would bloody well make sure that they knew was how to use a computer, how to program, man. Because if you're smart and you can use a computer, you are so much smarter than you are if you're just smart that it's not even funny. You know, and you talk to people, you see this in Silicon Valley all the time, you talk to people who are expert computer users, they are so bloody powerful, it is just beyond belief. So, and that's going to do nothing but expand, right? Because Moore's law is not dead, and computers are doubling in power every 18 months, and who the hell knows where that's going to go. So your kids, they should know everything they possibly can about how to spin a computer on their finger like a basketball player. So
is that one of the reasons why you love Twitter so much?
Well, Twitter, yeah. I have pulled back from Twitter almost entirely in the last 4 months, and I can't say that that's done me any psychological harm. I've quit reading the comments. You know, the comments on Twitter are really kind of, they're such an odd way of communicating, because let's say you tweet something out and it goes out to, oh, who knows, I think I have 1 million Twitter followers, it's something like that. And I don't know how many of them read what I tweet, but let's say 10,000 or something. It's just a guess. Who comments? It's not like it's a random sample. You know, like if I just pointed to 50 people in the audience randomly and asked for an opinion about something, I'd kind of get a good sample of what the audience thought. But if I said, okay, who had an absolutely dreadful morning and is just as bitchy as can possibly be imagined? Okay, so why don't all you people stand up, okay? And then I'll ask the most miserable of you for your opinion. That's kind of what Twitter's like. You know, so it's a form of pseudo-information. It's like you're communicating with people, and you respond to it like you're communicating with people because, well, you're accustomed to communicating with people, and so that's how you respond. But you don't know what the hell's going on with the person who's commenting. You don't know if they are even real, if they're hiding behind some false pseudonym, or if they're trolling, or like I said, if they just had an absolutely miserable day and need to, you know, throw a dart at someone to alleviate some of their stress. So, and that's a problem with social media in general, all these new communication technologies that we've evolved. We really have no idea what they're doing to us. I mean, they're really, really hard on young women in particular. Facebook, and I mean, you think about it, you know, when I was a teenager, I mean, I did, God, if I had to write a book about the stupid things I did when I was a teenager, it'd be a very thick book. And it'd be a worse book if there were photographs accompanying it. And, you know, but I had this advantage that young people today don't have, which was, well, when my day of stupidity was over, I could go home and it was not there. You know, like, it wasn't on Twitter, it wasn't on Facebook. There wasn't 20 of my friends communicating to me about, you know, what foolish thing I did at the party the night before. And young people now, they're just followed by paparazzi, essentially, constantly. And I've watched that with the young teenage daughters of many of my friends, because my kids were a little too old for that to actually have happened to them. But God, it's miserable. And we know that there is some relationship between the amount of time people use Facebook, for example, and their mental health, which means the more they use Facebook, the more depressed they are. And it might be that the depression is driving the Facebook use, but the causal pathway seems to be the other way around, which is, you know, it's just playing that unbelievably exposed social game. That's hard on people. And these aren't trivial technologies, you know. I mean, they're transforming the way we communicate with one another, and that's And they're completely uncontrolled experiments. We have no idea what the medium or long-term consequences are going to be. And we'll never find out either, because, of course, the communication landscape changes so quickly that by the time you get adapted to one communication technology, another one has come along that's even more confusing that you now have to master. And so, well, that's why it's necessary for everyone to develop their own modicum of wisdom, I believe, because I don't know how else we're going to be able to deal with this technological transformation that's going to come is already coming across us like a tidal wave. And you know, you ain't seen nothing yet. The people in Silicon Valley have plans that, well, that make you think that the whole place should probably be bombed just for the safety of the rest of us. You know, because there's tremendous danger in that rapid acceleration of machine intelligence, and we have absolutely no idea where that's headed. So, and maybe it'll be great. It's possible that it'll be great, but power cuts both ways. So hopefully we can control it with our wisdom, and that's pretty much up to each of you to put your lives together so you can make good decisions.
So let me ask you this question. This is more for myself. This is maybe the audience here can process it any way they want. You know, we started a company based on a vision of capitalism, and I promised myself I'm going to be talking about this for the rest of my life, on me coming here from Iran and understanding how this system works and why so many immigrants come here. So I said, for the rest of our careers, we're going to be talking about this. And we're multicultural. We got a lot of different nationalities. And that's 54% Latino. I think the second largest population in this room is probably African American, and then it's going to be Caucasian, and then it's going to be, I can't let out my Filipino community that we have here as well. And then we got a handful of Middle Easterns here as well, a few hundred Middle Easterns. But here's my question for you. And by the way, I want everybody to hear. I actually don't have a clue what he's going to say, but I'm very curious.
I don't have a clue what I'm going to say either.
For me, over the years, I like to ask birthdays. When your birthdays? To me, and I've stored in my mind. I said, boom, is there any kind of correlation between these nights? And it's not even horoscope. It's just purely a date to me. It's not like, oh, you're Libra, you're this. I go through dates, right? And then the next thing I do when I start asking people questions is if they like math or they don't like math. So one time we're sitting there, we're having a debate politically about capitalism and economy and how money works and all this other stuff. And this one person was absolutely against capitalism, okay? It's like, oh my gosh, this whole capitalism stuff, it's, you know, who cares about the money and who cares about this? And I said, let me ask you a question. Were you somebody that liked math growing up? I hated math. I said, interesting. Okay, very interesting that you hated math. Do you think some of us are born with liberal wiring and some of us are born with conservative wiring? So it's 40-40. So I've got 3 kids and they're all different. From day one, they've all been different, right? 40-40, and then there's a 20% in the middle that's kind of trying to figure out, let me see which argument makes more sense. Okay, this makes sense. Okay, cool. I think this makes sense, because it seems like some people, no matter what you say, they're just not going to change. And there's no way in the world if 45%, whatever the numbers are, Democrats and 45% are Republicans, let's just say you put that number there, you can't say both sides are idiots, because one side says the other side are idiots, the other side says the other sides are idiots. It's just, you can't sit there and think that. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, they're both right some of the time.
Right, so they're both right some of the time. But do you think some of the belief system that we have politically, liberal or conservative, we're born with?
Oh, yes.
You do think that?
Oh, I think the evidence for
that's
that's
Tell
very
us
clear.
more. Tell us why you say that.
Well, okay, so there have been good personality studies done for, I would say, about 30 years. And the reason for that is that we figured out a personality model about 30 years ago that's stable cross-culturally, and it was mostly derived statistically, and it required a fair bit of computational power to derive. And basically, the way that it was derived was that thousands of people were asked hundreds and hundreds of questions, and then computers could figure out how the answers grouped. So if you were likely to say yes to question A and also to question J, maybe that was a tendency across a large group of people, and so you could assume that there was something similar about question A and J, and you could sort the questions into groups. And it turns out that questions about personality sort into 5 groups. And there's some argument about exactly the right number, but it doesn't matter. It's somewhere between 5 and 7, and you can break the 5 down into 10, but whatever. We've got a pretty good overall descriptive structure, like the periodic table of the elements for personality. And if you're an extrovert, man, it's like you want to be where the action is. You want to be where the party is. You're telling jokes, and you're setting up social occasions, and you smile a lot, and you talk a lot, and you want people around you all the time. And a tremendous amount of that is influenced genetically. And you can tell that if you have children, because your children are like that from like day one.
No doubt about it, yeah.
My son's quite extroverted. Well, my daughter is as well, but he was a flirt when he was 9 months old. It was ridiculous. Well, it was ridiculous. My wife used to pack him along on her back on one of those little, and I would do the same thing, on one of those little, those little baby carriers. And I can remember one time we were on a cruise ship, just taking a small cruise from Maine to Nova Scotia, and we got on the boat, and we were wandering through a group of people, and it was like being with a rock star, because he was sitting in the back of the little baby holder, smiling away, like flirting like mad, and waving at everyone. And that was there right at 9 months. And so people differ in extroversion, and that's positive emotion. They differ in neuroticism, and that's negative emotion. Some people are much more sensitive to depression and grief and anxiety. Their threshold for threat is a lot lower. Some people are agreeable rather than disagreeable, and agreeable people are very empathic and self-sacrificing. And the empathic part is good because, it's useful to be empathic, especially if you're caring for people who are in real trouble. But the self-sacrificing isn't so good. That can make you resentful and also decrease the probability that you're going to be successful in your salary negotiations and so forth. So those of you who are agreeable and have a hard time standing up for yourself and fighting, you'll fight for other people but not for yourself, it's a very good skill to develop, that ability to watch your resentment and see what you need and then make a case for it. It's a hard thing to learn. People differ in conscientiousness, that's orderliness and industrious, and they differ in creativity, which is openness. And a lot of that's genetic. It's there to begin with. Now, you can move that with the environment, but you have a character. It's there. Liberals are higher in openness, that's trait creativity, and lower in conscientiousness, especially orderliness. And that seems to be because they believe, or their let's say, their niche is an informational niche. They believe that the free flow of information is worth the risk. So that'd be the free flow of people across borders, the free flow of ideas across borders, the free flow of concepts across categories. They'd rather that the borders were permeable. Now, the conservatives are low in openness and high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they take the opposite tack. They think, well, yeah, there's danger in too much openness. There's danger in borders that are too permeable. Things can change too fast. Entire societies can become destabilized, and everyone can end up not knowing which way is up. And the thing is that both of those attitudes are correct. It depends on the time, because sometimes sometimes things are changing so fast that everybody's knocked off their feet and things are falling apart. And sometimes things are so rigid that there isn't any new water flowing and everything's ground to a halt. You see that in corporations very often, where they get ossified, and there's no new ideas, and then they collapse. The average Fortune 500 company only lasts, I think now it's only 24 years. And the duration of their occupation of the top Fortune 500 space is getting shorter and shorter every year. You need liberals because now and then the right thing to do is to come up with something new. And you need conservatives because now and then the right thing to do is to do what everybody has always done. And the reason you need political dialogue is so that the liberals and the conservatives can continue to argue about which of those solutions is appropriate right now. And
That's powerful, Jordan. And that's a unifying message, by the way. That's a unifying message that you're not hearing.
Yes.
Today, it's not a unifying message that we need each other. Today, it's more, we're smart, you're dumb, and you have no clue what you're talking about. And you're trying to take advantage of people. Versus, hey, we need to kind of process this thing together.
No, it's really a bad idea, you know, like, it's a really bad idea, because here's another example. So, you know, Silicon Valley tends to be liberal. Everyone knows that. And the reason for that is that there's a tremendous number of entrepreneurs there. And entrepreneurs tend to be high in openness and lower in conscientiousness. So they're creative, but they're also willing to break rules, you know, which you kind of have to do often. Hopefully not to a criminal extent, but you have to. Well, you know, it's tricky when you're trying to establish something new, because look at a company like Uber. You know, they had to bend the rules to be successful. And those companies that have rented those scooters out and put them on the streets everywhere, you know, they just kind of went ahead and did it. It's not something an orderly person would do, because they'd ask for permission, whereas the people who started these scooter rental companies just said, well, what'll happen if we put them everywhere? And the answer was, that seemed to work. But, you know, you have to have a rule-breaking proclivity in order to manage that. But the thing is, if you're an entrepreneur, you need conservative people, because once you've figured out how to do something, and then you want to run it algorithmically, you know, you want to run it by the rules, well, then it's the conservative types that are going to be really good at doing that and making sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and show up for work on time and have stable marriages and be reliable. And their problem is it's easy for them to get stuck in a rut. So this is also Rule 9, which is, you know, attend to the person you're listening to as if they might know something you don't. It's like, I really find it interesting to talk to people whose political opinions differ from mine. And for me, that's mostly meant talking to really strong conservatives, because I would say temperamentally I tilt in the liberal direction, although being a social scientist has made me more conservative. It's very interesting to talk to people who don't share your political views if you listen to them, because they'll tell you all sorts of things about why they think that you just don't understand. And it's not that they're wrong. It's that sometimes they're wrong and sometimes they're right. And the whole point of free speech, as far as I can tell, the deep point of free speech is that, you know, it's all as if we're riding on the back of a giant snake, and it's twisting and turning all the time, and we're trying to figure out how to stay in the center so that we don't fall off the sides, you know. And sometimes it's time for a bit of a tilt to the left, and sometimes it's time for a bit of a tilt to the right. And the only way you can tell when that time is by having a discussion about it. And so it's the discussion that keeps us centered. It's not the fact that the conservatives are right or that the liberals are right. They're both necessary, annoying as that is. So
let me ask you this. To follow up on that. So is there such a thing, because, so I sit there and I listen to somebody. I was at Wayne Hughes' house, and Wayne Hughes had Bill Clinton's campaign manager, and Wayne Hughes had George Bush's campaign manager, right? And it's only 40 of us, and this is like 10 years ago, and they're both debating on their argument. Both very convincing, okay? They're both very convincing and persuasive. Is there such a thing as 100% truth? Or is truth always adapting? Because if what you're saying is, it's opinions, listen to both opinions and see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, versus, is there something that I can look for that gets my argument a point to say, you know what, this is the accurate 100% truth, I'm going to solve it based on this. Because in math, 3 times 3 is 9. I don't need a liberal, conservative, libertarian, conservative, you know, whoever it is to tell me, right? 3 times 3 is math. Is there that as well, to look at arguments and say, this is the truth based on this, or are we having to still be a little bit nimble to see what both arguments are?
Well, I would say 2 things about that. One is, I think there are times when you can establish truths. This is one of the reasons I like Bjorn Lomborg's work. He wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place. And what he did was put together these 10 teams of economists, and he had them rank order the problems in terms of return on investment, and then he averaged across their estimates and came up with a final list. you know, that's not a bad application of the search for objective truth in the political and social domain. So, and it's relatively apolitical, right? Because the economists he gathered represented a variety of different political beliefs, and so I think there are times when there are objective facts that present themselves in the political sphere, but most of the time political discussion is it's more like marital negotiation, you know, and it's right when it works in the world. That would be the first thing. Like, let's say you have a plan and you implement the plan, and the plan turns out the way that you expected it to. It's a pragmatic definition of truth. Okay, that plan, flawed, no doubt that it was, imperfect, no doubt that it was accurate enough so that when you implemented it, it justified its own structure. And that's a lot of the way we judge truth in the world, right? Is you think you're right if you do something and it works. And that doesn't mean you're 100% right, and it doesn't mean it's going to work forever, but because you're ignorant and because your knowledge is limited, that's kind of what you've got. And so that's one form of truth. And then another form is, well, can we agree in a negotiated manner? Like, we kind of hope that if we're trying to solve a problem, that we can talk until we come up with the least bad alternative that both of us can live with.
But that's not the truth, though. We're compromising, right? Maybe your idea is better than my idea. I'm not, you know what I'm saying? So let's just say your idea is better than my idea, but I'm better at convincing you than you are convincing me. That doesn't mean the best idea is being implemented, right?
Oh, that happens all the time. There's lots of times when the best idea doesn't win.
Right.
You know, but that's partly why the fact that we're constrained by the world is helpful. I mean, what you want to do in politics...
You know what I'm saying? Like, what I'm trying to say is like, so I want to know, is there a formula to get to the truth so then I can say, this is where I stand on this position? Or is it all about a lot of going back and forth and discord until I'm kind of like, okay, I kind of relate to this? 100% truth versus 70%, 80%? You know what I'm asking?
I think 100% truths are very difficult to come by.
That's where I'm going with that.
You know,
okay.
I mean, I've been trying to identify 100% truths, the 100% truths, let's say, that sit at the bottom of our societies. And one of the things that I believe to be true is that the idea that the individual is properly sovereign, I believe, is as true as any idea that human beings have ever come up with. I think that that idea works. Not everyone would agree with that. The more complex the situation, the harder it is to extract out something approximating an objective truth. And so then so much of it depends on negotiation and discussion and agreement. Now, there are ways of addressing that as well. You know, one of the reasons that the United States works so nicely compared to many other countries is that, well, you have a plethora of states, and each of those states, in some sense, is an experiment. And all of the sub-structures of those states are experiments.
Sure.
And you know, because you have so many experiments going on, which is also one of the advantages of an open society, is you can kind of observe and see with all these solutions being generated which ones seem to be efficient and effective. And so one of the ways that you come up with truth from the political level is essentially through a Darwinian process. You know, if you really want to solve a complicated problem, maybe you try to solve it 100 ways, and then you take the best solution.
Got it.
And look, this happens to entrepreneurs all the time too. You know, like most entrepreneurs, this is something to know, well, most entrepreneurs, most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. And so that's also Darwinian in some sense. You know, you're creating all these little enterprises that are sort of alive. They're run by people, after all. And even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, You know, what do they say? If at first you fail, then try again. And that would probably mean try something different rather than the same thing. But persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. You know, and some of that's useful because there's probably some things that you could improve about yourself. But it's very difficult to go from 0 to 1, you know. If you're starting out as a salesperson, for example, the hardest sale is the first customer. And then, you know, they get easier with each additional customer. But
So last question for you before we wrap up. Last question before we wrap up is, so say I see somebody in the room here, hypothetically, and I say, oh my gosh, I would love to, you know, have that kind of a life. I'd love to make that kind of money, right? And I compare myself to them, right? I'm saying, oh my gosh, what if one day I can be that person? What if one day I can have that life, right? How do I go from there to actually wanting to live it and become a reality versus not allowing envy and resentment pin me against them? Kind of like, you know, Cain wanted to be Abel, but he couldn't, so he goes and, you know, kills Abel. How do you manage that?
Well, the first thing I think you need to understand is that these people that you're comparing yourself to, you don't really know very well. You know, and what that means is that you see their shiny outside, but you don't see the reality of their life. And so what you're... You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell, and people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And so the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. And you know, I can give you just one example. Like, I know a fair number of extremely wealthy people, and most of the people I happen to know are people who've made their money themselves. And I tell you, man, they have a burden of responsibility that would crush me, would crush the typical person. They're just working flat out, like 90 hours a week, and they have thousands of people depending on them. And, you know, they have their money, and they have their status, and that's not nothing. But don't be thinking that there isn't a price to be paid for that. You know, they don't see their families, they're often divorced, they don't see their children grow up. And they don't have time off. Now, there are wealthy, what would you call, playboy types, I suppose, who live out the dreams of wealth of a foolish 14-year-old, but they're not that common. And you have to be careful of what you're jealous of because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand that you're different from everyone else. And this is especially true as you get older. When you're 17 or 16 or something like that, comparing yourself to other people makes a certain amount of sense because 16 and 17-year-olds, they're kind of the same, you know, which is why when you go off to university, you can make friends so quickly. It's like, I'm just about 60. It takes me like 15 years to make a friend now, you know, as opposed to the 2 months that it took when I was 17. You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family, they don't have your temperament, they don't have your troubles, they don't have your abilities. The only person that the only person that has those is you. And this is why one of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win because you could be a little better today than you were yesterday. And that's a good thing. You're a little better. That's a good thing. And you know, no doubt there are some things that you could improve. You know, if you sit and meditate for any length of time about what you're not doing optimally, answers will spring to mind. You know, you could be getting up earlier. You could be watching YouTube less, unless they're my videos, in which case you could be watching them more. Anyways, can't believe I said that, actually. I actually can't believe I said that.
That's the entrepreneur side of you.
But like, comparing yourself to who you are now, that's a game you can win. And like, I've seen this be effective in many, many cases. In my clinical practice, for example, it's like you take stock of where you are. You know, what your advantages are and what your disadvantages are. And then you start with a little humility on the path of incremental improvement. And, you know, incremental improvement compounds. And so you can get a long ways. And then it's, you see, because trajectory in some sense is more important than position for human beings. I mean, if you're starving to death and ill, that's not the situation that I'm describing. But, you know, if you've got the bare necessities of life, and so you're not surrounded by absolute privation, what you really want is to see that you're on an uphill path, you know, something that's got the right slope, and you can start anywhere on that path, and you can improve 0.5% a day or 1/4% a day, and you think, well, that's not very much. It's like, it's 100%. If it's 1/4% a day, it's 100% in 4 years, and that doesn't count compounding. You know, which means it's actually going to happen a lot faster. So,
and that's duplicatable. Anybody can do that. Anybody can do that. It's not just applicable to the most talented person or the least talented. Anybody can do that.
I think that the possibility that you can make yourself slightly better on a continual basis is, I think that's something that's accessible to everyone. I think that's equivalent to leading a virtuous life. And, you know, I talked about the terrible catastrophe in some sense of differences in intelligence and differences in conscientiousness and so forth, and the downside of the meritocracy. But there is something to be said for virtue and truth, you know, and that is one thing. Another thing that I've noticed about people who've been phenomenally successful is that they really do everything they can to live a truthful life, and that you can get a bloody long ways by being honest. It's really something. And so